Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is the Casual Friday podcast. In this week's podcast, I went on a textile adventure in Chicago. I have several finished projects, some knitted, one sewn. I did a dyeing experiment on my hand spun yarn that's destined to become a sweater. So let's get started. I took a week off from my channel because it's spring break season and it was my birthday this past weekend. And so we hadn't been anywhere this winter. We've had a really mild winter, so it hasn't been so bad. Sometimes this time of year we have to get out of here. But we hadn't traveled anywhere at all. And I thought, oh, that would be a great weekend to go visit our daughter Sophia, who lives in Chicago, and celebrate my birthday down there, just take a little road trip. And so that's what we planned. And I was thinking about what kinds of things I might like to do in Chicago that maybe we haven't already done, and that would also be suitable for the weather. Like if it's summertime, we can do a lot of things outside, but not so much this time of year, even though the winter has been mild. So one of the things I thought I might want to do was something I hadn't done since I was 17. The summer I was 17, right before my senior year in high school, I was at Northwestern University for a summer high school institute program in journalism. So it was 5 weeks long, and then on the weekends and stuff, they would take us around different places in Chicago. We went to, I think it was a White Sox game, maybe it was Cubs. And they took us to Pizzeria Uno, and we went to Second City. And it was not anything I'd ever heard of. I was familiar with Saturday Night Live. That came on, started airing when I was in 8th grade. So it had been on the air for a few years, and that's sketch comedy. Well, a lot of people from SNL come from these improv groups, and Second City is one of them. The Groundlings is another one, but Second City is the one that started in Chicago. And so it was sketch comedy, but it was also improv. And this was in the late 1970s. So this was not something I had ever heard of before, like improv. And it was so fun. I mean, it was a vivid memory of seeing them, ask for things from the audience and then using that to build a skit. And that's what I vividly remembered. And I just think it's amazing to watch people be able to do that. So we got tickets to Second City. They have a ton of different shows on different stages. We got one that was on the main stage. It was really good. I got good seats. We were right literally in front. It was a 2-hour show, and I was kind of surprised at how much of it was sketch comedy. And so there was stuff that, they would do every night and certain skits, and they were good. And there were 4 places where they did improv bits where they were asking for, stuff from the audience, and which was my favorite part of it, because that's the part that I just don't get to see very much. I mean, you can see sketch comedy all the time on TV if you want, but the improv thing was what was really fun. So that was what I wanted to do. That was the one thing I knew for sure I wanted to do. I also always like to go to a yarn shop whenever I travel somewhere. So I looked at where my daughter's neighborhood was. She lives in a fun neighborhood called Logan Square in Chicago. And I was looking to see if there was any yarn shops or craft stores or, what might be there. And so there's a yarn shop called Firefly. Its thing, is that it has like sustainable yarns or locally produced yarns, that sort of a thing. So I was interested to see what kinds of things that they might carry there, because I figured that at least some of it would be stuff I wouldn't have seen anywhere else. Then I just looked to see what else was in the neighborhood, and there is a place called the Waste Shed. And what it is, it's a thrift store that is craft supplies. So they get most of their funding comes from the donations, and then they sell them. But it's yarn, knitting needles, fabric, beads, all just, whatever, paper stuff, anything for doing any kind of craft, they have it there. Because I'm getting back into sewing and I want to make, there's a couple of summer tops that I want to make that take a similar amount of fabric. I want to do some of them multiple times. So I thought I'm going to see if I can find anything there that I might want to make a shirt. I don't want to just buy impulse fabric. I want to buy things with a purpose. And the same thing with the yarn shop. There's a project for part of my long-term project to knit stockings from different centuries and different, time periods to kind of understand the evolution of them. I want to knit a stocking from the first known published stocking pattern, which was in Natura Externata, I think is the name of the book. It was like a household book of all sorts of things, like different recipes for food, for medicines, for how to make this or how to do this, and it included a stocking pattern in it. That's the earliest known published one. A lot of knitting historians over the years had struggled to try to make sense of it because it's written over multiple columns and it's all one sentence. A number of people tried to knit it and thought there's no way, this doesn't make any sense, and they were knitting it based on their contemporary knowledge of stockings and socks. So Chris Lanning, she wrote an article for Piecework back in January, February, I believe it was 2013, not 2014, and I'll put this information down in the show notes about these stockings, and that she understood that nobody had really been able to crack it and create a pair of stockings from them. She hadn't read what they had tried or how they had interpreted it. She didn't want to be persuaded by somebody else's struggles. She went through it and she just decided, I'm just going to follow the instructions and see what happens. And there are some interesting differences in how the stocking was constructed. And she thought through, like, why would this be? Oh, first of all, the style of stockings was different back then. And secondly, the firmness of the fabric that you'd be creating might mean that they need to be looser around the ankle. So she had all these explanations for it. And she really only found one place where there was an error, where there was a line repeated twice. And it was a place where there was supposed to be symmetry at the ankles, and she could see that the instructions weren't going to be symmetrical. But otherwise, she came up with a pretty wearable pair of stockings. So I was going to look for the yarn to make those stockings at the yarn shop. I wanted fabric for a shirt at the Waist Shed. And luckily, I came away with even more than that, because on my birthday, the plan was we would go to brunch at a really nice place in Logan Square, and then we would walk up to the yarn shop, 15 minutes in one direction, and then we'd come back toward where we ate brunch 15 minutes, and then another 15 minutes in the other direction to the Waist Shed. So we got to brunch and there was a 1 hour wait, even at 10 o'clock. So there was a bookstore right next door. And so we went to a bookstore and I bought a book. So I want to go to the overhead and show you the things that I got. I got a book, I got yarn, and I got fabric. And I had a really wonderful time. I had a lot of wonderful meals. And then while we were gone, we got very little snow this year. It was the most mild winter. We had the earliest 70-degree day on record. I mean, several weeks ago, we got up to 70. While we were gone, we got a foot of snow here in Minneapolis. And so we were really worried about driving home, what the conditions were going to be like. It was raining, the temperature went up, and it was raining most of the drive back. It takes about 7 hours to drive from Chicago to Minneapolis on the highways. And by the time we got back, the highways were all cleared. The roads were pretty much cleared. And a lot of the snow had gone down because it had gotten so wet. And so we shoveled that out. And then the next day we got another, 5-6 inches of snow. So we picked the perfect day to come back. And I think if in any other winter, I would just be so over getting a foot of snow and then another half a foot of snow at this time of year. I mean, it happens all the time, but I would have been completely over it. I would have been so sick of it. But we've had such a small amount of snow that I was actually happy to see it, and it's going to give the ground some moisture, much needed moisture. So all in all, it was a fantastic weekend, a wonderful week for my birthday. So let's go to the overhead and I'll show you what I came home with. So while we were at brunch, we had an hour to kill and there was a bookstore nearby, and I thought, this reminds me of my childhood. Going to bookstores on Sunday with my mother. That's probably the kind of shopping I did most with my mother, but this time I'm the mother and I was with my daughter, and it was a nice little independent bookstore. And so I wanted to see what they had in the craft section. They had a cooking section, which is interesting to look at, but I wanted to see what other kinds of crafting, and I finally found a little section. There weren't any knitting books. I really wasn't expecting that. But they had this book, and I thought, well, this is interesting. I hadn't heard of this, but visible mending is a thing now, and I was just curious about what this book has. And it does have stuff for knitting, and I'm, pretty good with that and know how to mend it. So it's got illustrations, and it's, pictures of patches and different things. But they talk about different kinds, they have really basic instructional information in here, but different ways of creating on woven fabric, different kinds of stitches, different ways of repairing things using decorative stitches. They do have a section on knitting in here as well. 3 ways to patch holes. So I just thought this could be an interesting resource, because I'm always looking for good ideas. When I look at a hole, I think, how can I make this stable? And and I'm not thinking so much about decorativeness. And so this gives me some ideas about how to do things. But this looks like it would be a good thing for someone who really knows very little about making or repairing clothing. I mean, it's showing how to sew on buttons here, for example. So reattaching belt loops, all kinds of things, mending leggings, reinforcing the seat in pants. So it's kind of an interesting book, and I'm glad I happened to come across it. I'm glad we had a little bit of a wait for our brunch. So this is the yarn that I got. What was interesting to me about it was that it was sport weight, which is what I was looking for. There weren't a whole lot of choices of sport weight, but I was really interested in that it was 100% Michigan grown BFL Romney wool. So BFL is blue-faced Leicester, if you don't know. So these are both really nice wools, and it's a nice yarn. It feels nice. I like this kind of silvery color. Unfortunately, because sport weight is on a spectrum, and it's on a spectrum that really overlaps with fingering weight and DK weight, that this is a little too heavy toward the DK weight. I need something that's a little more toward the fingering weight. And I should have known when I saw this, the yardage in here is 250 yards and 100 grams. Which is really more of a DK. I need something that's closer to 300, I think, because there's no way I can get the gauge I need for the project that I was wanting this yarn for. I've tried. There's just no way for me to get that gauge. And then I realized, there's good reason why you can't get that gauge. It's just too thick. I need to work the sport weight yarn at a firm gauge to get 7.5 stitches per inch. I'm not going to get a yarn that is meant for 5 to 6 stitches per inch down to 7.5. If it started at 6 or 6.5, I could get it down to 7.5, but I can get something this, personally, I can't do that. So I'm gonna have to come up with another project to use 500 yards of this beautiful yarn. I might dye this. I don't know, we'll see what happens. But it's a lovely yarn. I really do want to knit with it. I just can't knit my stocking project with this particular yarn. This is the fabric that I bought. There's 1 1/3 yards. So what is 1/3 of a yard? 12 inches. So 4 feet of it. And it's 54 inches wide. So what I was looking for was something that I could potentially make a summer shirt with. And so I'm hoping that because it's 53, 54 inches wide, I can make like a little short sleeve shirt of some sort. This is not like a fabric that's in fashion. It happens to be one that I really like, and it kind of reminds me of a shirt that I had probably in middle school back in the 70s. So maybe it's back in trend now again, but it kind of reminds me of the Madras shirts that were so popular back then. It's kind of, it has a gauze, it's thicker, but it's not completely see-through, so it would make a good shirt, but it's kind of that lightweight fabric that's a little bit gauzy. There's a little bit of like crepey texture to it in a way. I don't know how else to describe it. But it didn't cost me very much. I think I paid $6. I am going to try it out with one of the shirt patterns that I have. And if I don't like it, then I will consider it a mock-up that I've done with some inexpensive fabric. And if I do like it, then I'll be wearing it because these are colors that I really like. The only issue though is that it is a plaid, so I do have to think about pattern matching again, and that might be tough with this quantity of fabric. I just don't know. I will find out. This past summer, I started a hand spinning project that turned into a spinning project where I created enough yarn to make myself a sweater. So during this whole process, I've been thinking about what it is I wanted, what kind of sweater I want to design for this yarn. Do I want to dye some of it or all of it? Just trying to figure out what I'm going to do with it. Well, this week I dyed some of the yarn. My thought was that I would dye some of it so that I would have a contrast yarn, and maybe I would do a little bit of stranded color work, maybe at the cuffs and the hem or something. That was my latest thought. I've been toying with what kind of construction method I want to use, what sorts of details that I want to use. Every few weeks I think about it and I kind of change directions. And what I'm discovering is that as I get through one step and then the next, I see what the yarn is becoming, my ideas evolve. So I want to go to the overhead and show you the yarn that I dyed and then what it is I think I'm going to do next with the yarn. So this is the hand spun yarn in its natural gray state. And this is the color that I got when I dyed it, this kind of cyan or teal color. And I really like it. It's a nice contrast. My original idea was just to have a small amount of this and use it maybe with some stranded color work at the cuffs and at the hem. I don't know. You know, I've had various ideas for how to turn this into a sweater and what I wanted to do. And what I'm discovering is that I'm letting each step sort of take me to the next place on this journey. I've had different ideas for what I wanted to do with the sweater, but what I think I want to do now is dye some more of this and maybe do a gradient. The dyeing kit that I have is little jars of dyes, of powder, of acid dyes, is called Mother Mackenzie's Miracle Dye Mix. I got this from Clemis & Clemis. They make drum carders and other tools for hand spinners. And this is Judith Mackenzie. She's a well-known, sort of internationally known spinning teacher. So it comes with a bunch of different colors of dye, and then she shows you how you can mix them together to get different shades. So I wanted to try the cyan, and I mixed up what's called a 1% solution. So you have 1 gram of the dye powder, and you mix it with enough water to make 100 milliliters. So, and that means that it's a 1% solution. So 1% of that solution is the dye. And then if you want a medium color expression, then you use the 1% dye solution so that you use 1 milliliter for every 1 gram of wool that you have. So if you have 100 milliliters of the 1% solution and you have 100 grams of yarn, you'd use all 100 millimeters or milliliters to dye that 100 grams. What I did was I mixed up a jar that had like 300 milliliters of the 1% solution, and I only wanted to dye 75 grams of this, so I took 75 milliliters to dye the 75 grams. And because it started with this kind of darker base, it ended up quite dark. So she's got some different formulas in here for how you get different shades. So if you started with 100% magenta and you had a cream colored yarn, you'd get something like this with your 1% solution. If instead you mixed 80% magenta with 20% cyan, so you'd have 0.8 of a milliliter and 0.2 of a milliliter of each of these colors, and you could get that shade. And then as you did less magenta and more cyan, you'd get it become bluer and bluer. So I am not going to mix it with another color because this is the color that I'm actually mixing it with. What I'm going to do is do some more 75 gram hanks, and the next time I'm going to use my 1% solution with that 75 grams of yarn, but I'm only going to use 0.8 of a milliliter for each gram. So I will be using less and less of my dye solution for each hank of yarn. And so instead of ending up with magenta at the end, I'll just end up with my gray. So I'll have 5 shades of the cyan and then the gray. So that's what I'm thinking about doing with the dyeing. That's my current plan. So I have preferences in my knitting. I think all of us do. I prefer knitting socks cuff down to knitting them toe up, but I will knit them toe up if there's a specific reason to do that. I prefer knitting my sweaters bottom up in pieces and then seaming them because I like working with smaller pieces. But I will work in the round if there's a reason to, a good reason to, and I will work top down if there's a specific reason to. It isn't the way that I prefer to knit. So all along, my thinking has been that I would be knitting this handspun sweater bottom up. I felt like I had enough yarn to do that. I wasn't, worried about how much I had left. On the other hand, just to hedge my bets, maybe I should do a top down. I wasn't sure. What I did know was that I didn't want a circular yoke sweater and I didn't want a raglan sweater. Those are fine. A lot of people like them. I just prefer set-in sleeves. So I think what I'm going to do now that my current plan is to create a gradient of colorway of my yarn is that the best way to work with that would be top down so that I can get the upper part all in one color and then switch to working the body, dividing up the yarn based on how much of it I want to knit, and make sure that if I'm knitting essentially wide stripes or gradient stripes or something like that, that I portion out the yarn accordingly. So my current thinking is that I do want to knit top down, and that in order to use the gradient, start either with the gray and then start working the dark color going down, or starting with the darkest color and then working toward the lighter gray at the bottom. I don't know which direction. I'd be interested to know if any of you have opinions about that, and then why. Like, why do you think that would be a better way to go? So aside from determining that I'm going to do it top down instead of bottom up, I also need to think about what kind of neckline I want and sleeve construction. I really don't care that much for raglans and circular yokes. They're fine to look at. It's just not my preference for what I want to knit. I really like sweaters with set-in sleeves. That is just my preference. And I can do that top down seamlessly. I've done it a number of times. So that's not an issue. So I have had some thoughts about a kind of a collar that I wanted. I'm thinking at this point I might do a cardigan, which is making me think about buttons. But I still am thinking about doing a particular collar that I wanted. Originally, I was thinking of doing a little placket with a couple of buttons and then this kind of polo collar. But now I'm thinking of doing a cardigan instead, so buttons all the way down, but maybe still do that collar. There's a particular technique used in conjunction with that collar that I found in a book I talked about a couple of weeks ago that I'm still interested in using and I want to use for this sweater. I don't think that I'm going to use any sort of stitch pattern. Normally that's what keeps me kind of sane is having some kind of stitch pattern. And I'm thinking that my first hand spun sweater, I'm doing some interesting things with the dyeing. I might just keep it simple when it comes to the stitch pattern and just keep it in stockinette. That's my current thinking at any rate. We'll see what happens in the next Casual Friday. So I just finished another pair of socks on our, I knit one of these socks before our trip, and the second one I knit mostly on the trip. I haven't woven my ends in yet. These aren't washed yet either. I often use what is called a plain heel. It's a peasant heel. It's another version of the peasant heel. A lot of people knit this kind of heel after they've knit the entire tube of the leg and the foot. Then they come back and they open up that tube and insert the heel. So you can do that as a forethought heel where you mark the place where you are going to have that opening, or you can do an afterthought where you just snip out some stitches. You don't have it marked with waste yarn. Or you can do it in this version where you don't come back afterwards. You knit it in when you get to that point in the sock. So you can do this toe up or cuff down. I prefer knitting cuff down socks, so that's when I do it. You do it using a provisional cast on to get started. You knit your sock, and I've explained this multiple times. I've got videos on my channel for how to do this type of heel. So you knit your leg as long as you want it, and then when you want to do the heel, you put the instep stitches on waste yarn to hold them. So these are still live, the heel stitches. And then you do a provisional cast on. You could do regular cast on. That's what they did in the 19th century for this type of heel. Except then, you pick up and you have the little ridge on the inside. So I do a provisional cast on. And that creates the other half of the round. And the nice thing about this is that you can cast on a different number of stitches than what you put on hold here. And for me, because I have that really long heel diagonal, I cast on extra stitches, and then I'm working the heel in the round. Another reason I like this heel is that it is knit in the round rather than back and forth. The first few rounds, you're decreasing out the extra stitches that you have if you have cast on extra stitches for the heel half. Some people might have a larger ankle and a smaller foot, and they might actually want to cast on a smaller number of stitches. And if you did that, then on this half of the round, you would eliminate those extra stitches until you had the same number of stitches for each half of the round. And then you work it just like a sock toe, where you are doing you're doing 4 decreases every other round until you're down to about 1/3 of the stitches, and then you can graft it shut. And you can use, if you don't like doing Kitchener stitch for grafting, you can use the Finchley graft because everything's really nice and open here. It's easy to access. The Finchley graft is a simpler process for creating the exact same result. It's done on the purl side. It's a technique that I found in a 19th century book to teach children skills for becoming servants to the middle class. It was the Finchley manual, so that's why I called it the Finchley graft. Then when you are done with the heel, you have more stitches on this half because you've done that provisional cast on with more or fewer stitches. And then if you need the foot to be a smaller number than what you currently have, then you would do some decreases. So I have a few rounds of decreases. So for my daughter's fiance, I add a couple of extra stitches for his heel, and then I don't decrease out any of them because he's got a larger foot circumference than leg circumference, so he needs those extra stitches. So that's one of the reasons I really like the flexibility of this plain heel, is because it allows you to adjust the stitch count that you're going to need for the second half of the sock. And you do end up with a little gusset potentially if you need one or not. Now, the thing that I did differently in this sock, I did a different toe than I'd ever done. And I want to try it again with some modifications because there are some issues with it. So this is a sock toe that I got out of this little book. It was originally published in the 1890s, and then it was reprinted, and it was translated into so many different languages. So it's this toe right here. The 19th century, they were still working out the best way of writing knitting instructions, and this one was a little bit of a puzzler. It seems straightforward at first until you actually start knitting and saying, wait a second, what are you talking about? Essentially, what you are doing, you can kind of see how it's, there's a spiral. You can see it in the light colored yarn here. There's a bit of a spiral. And the spirals actually started down here in this really dark place right here. You have 4 decreases per round. And you're using an SSK decrease. So you start by decreasing the first 2 stitches. So if you divided your round into 4 parts, so you have the first quarter, the second quarter, the third, and the fourth. And that's how I started, with a marker there. So I did the first 2 stitches, I decreased together with an SSK, worked to the marker, and then I did the first 2 after that marker, and then the first 2 of the second half of the round, and then the first 2 at the beginning of the fourth quarter. Then you work a plain round, and then this is where it's different from other similar sock toes, is that, let me get in closer so you can see. So this dark stitch right here, that was the first 2 stitches of the second quarter. I did a plain round, which is in this light blue, and then I did the next decrease. I did not use that first stitch as part of the decrease. Instead, that stitch was worked plain, and I decreased together what originally were the 3rd and 4th stitches. And then the next time I decrease, it's what was originally the 5th and 6th stitches. So you're always moving it over. So if this had been a regular spiral where you were always working that first stitch together with whatever is the current second stitch, you would, and your spiral would come up to that until you'd eliminated all but the last stitch of that each quarter. So it would be more of a diagonal coming up this way. What happens here is that you end up spiraling around the back side. And so at some point, you when you get to the end of that first quarter, you start encroaching on the second quarter. And so the spirals start moving around. So I had 60 stitches on the needle. I ended up, the first spiral went around 1.5 times. So you end up going around with this stitch count 1.5 times. So I thought it was really interesting, and you decrease down until you have just the 4 stitches left, which is not very many, and it's kind of pointy. And I know that this wouldn't work for a lot of people. So it works okay for me. Again, these haven't been washed and blocked, so the fabric hasn't relaxed and it hasn't conformed to my foot yet. So there's a little bit of a nipple right here. But what happens around, I have a foot shape that works okay with this, because I have kind of a slight angle right here and then more of an angle like that. And a lot of people have more straight toes. So I know that this wouldn't work for a lot of people. And I don't think it works particularly well for me. I think it's a little tight around this toe right here. I think what I would like to try is the spiraling, but have it be as long as you'd have for just a standard wedge toe, and then graft across the top. So it wouldn't go 1.5 times around, but it might go, it might be to the point where, you know, you've met, it's traveled across its entire span, maybe a little bit further, but then you can graft it with some number of, like 20 stitches remaining or something. And that would make it fit a little better. So I want to try that. I know it's hard to see because this is dark and then this is speckled and you're like, where are the decreases even showing up? So I am going to experiment with this because I think it's interesting. It's kind of entertaining. to keep track of where you are, but I want it to be more comfortable and figure out other ways of doing this. One thing that you could do also, instead of continuing to do the decrease every other round all the way to the top, is at some point you could start doing them every round. That would widen up and flatten the top a little bit. So there are a couple of different ways you could experiment with it. So keep an eye out on this because I think it's an interesting toe. I'm always interested in new ways of doing heels and toes and then figuring out how to make it so that it's comfortable. How do you modify it for different feet shapes? So sometime in the near future, I will do a video on a tutorial on this. Recently, a friend of mine, she's been my friend for 25 years. We met in a local fiction writers group and we were in a critique group together. We've been to writers conferences together. She's also a weaver, and now that she's retired, she's spending a lot more time on her weaving. So she's also a member of the Weavers Guild. We sometimes go to events together at the Weavers Guild. And so she understands the amount of work that it takes to make something, whether it's writing a novel or weaving something or knitting something. So over the years, I have knit her a couple of things and she really appreciates them. I knit her a pair of thrummed mittens years ago because she would take the bus downtown to work and it can get really cold standing at the bus stop in Minnesota winters. And I made her a pair of thrummed mittens and she loved them. And then a few years ago, she said, I have like a little hole in one of the mittens. Could you fix them? Like she loved these so much, they got worn out and then she wanted them to be able to still use them, and could I fix them? So she is absolutely knit worthy. A couple of weeks ago, she texted me and said, remember like back in 2009 when you knit that bamboo, she called it, for my sister-in-law? And what she was talking about was a prosthetic breast. It was a knitted knockers is what they're called. And I had knit her one out of bamboo and we called it a bamboo. And I said, yeah. And she's like, could I commission you to knit a couple more of those? And I said, who are they for? And she's like, oh, one would be for me and one would be for my sister. I'm like, oh my God. I'm like, what happened? So her sister had a mastectomy in January, and then my friend went to her annual checkup and they found a lump and she was being scheduled for surgery. She's had it since then, but at the time. And I said, well, here's the organization that has the pattern and they have certain recommendations for yarn. So it's an organization where you can knit these knitted knockers for them, and they distribute them free to different breast cancer clinics or to individuals who request one. They do them in all different sizes and different colors. They can be in skin tones or they can be in fun, bright colors. And so I found out, what yarn I thought I could get locally or by mail order, but I thought that came in a lot of colors. And I sent her the link. So she and her sister each chose a color. And she said, let me know. And then they figured out what size. They had to measure themselves because they do it by cup size, but it's not your bra cup size. It's actual size, sort of like with sewing patterns. The way that they do cup sizes is by absolute inches and not how bras do it, which is relative, like a B cup. A 34B is a smaller cup than a 38B. The Bs are not the same. So they figured out what cup size they needed, and she sent me the information, and then she said, well, let me know how much it's going to cost and I'll Venmo you the money. And I said, the only payment I want is another 25 years of friendship, because she's absolutely knit worthy. And I love that she didn't assume, like she didn't say, can you please do this for me? I just really appreciated the way she did it, but I also absolutely would not take any payment. So I want to go to the overhead and show you what they look like and talk a little bit about how they're constructed and some of the choices that I made that might have been a little different and how I might do them differently in the future. These are the two knockers that I made for my friend. If you have never seen these before, Originally, the pattern would start up here and you would do increases and then you would decrease out here and you'd end with a drawstring. Like you run the yarn through all of the live stitches so that it could be pulled shut. You wouldn't weave in that end. And what that allows you to do is take the stuffing out if you need to wash it, add more stuffing, take stuffing out. If you want to put some weights in it to give it just a little bit of weight, you could do that. These days they have the pattern now starts here, and you can either, well, the way they have you do it is just cast on, and then later you use the yarn tail to kind of weave in and out of the stitches around here in order to do the drawstring. I did that for this one. So there's a long tail cast on. And the benefit of doing that is that if the drawstring were to come out later, you wouldn't have live stitches that would be a problem to recapture. But it can be a little tighter. I use a long tail cast on. This might be a situation where I would use a knitted cast on instead, because that would give it a little bit more stretch and make it a little easier to get the stuffing in here. For this one, I used a pinhole cast on. I have a video of how to do that on my channel. So it's basically, you do have live stitches around the yarn tail when you start. Some of these cast on methods can be really hard, but I have a pretty easy one. You start with a crochet cast on that has half the number of stitches that you need, and then you work across by working a stitch or doing a yarn over and then working a stitch all the way across and then joining the round. And then the way that the crochet chain then unzips turns it into a drawstring. It's a little different than just if you've ever used a crochet cast on for a provisional cast on where you've done all of the stitches that you needed. It's just it's the same cast on, but the order in which you do things and how you manage the tail is a little different. But if you're interested in that cast on method, I'll leave it down in the show notes. This bit at the end, the nipple part, is done by doing a couple of rounds of I-cord, kind of rotating it around and then tacking it down. You don't have to do these. You can do them with or without a nipple. So if you know somebody who needs a knitted knocker, they can either contact the Knitted Knockers organization and ask for one to be sent to them, or you could knit one for them, and you just need to find out cup sizes and how big they would like it and what color they would like it. So the Knitted Knockers organization has a whole list of yarns. You need to use one of those yarns if you're knitting for their organization and making donations. These are yarns that are widely available. They're machine washable, natural fibers, and they're going to be comfortable next to the scars of someone who's had a mastectomy. So I chose to use bamboo pop. This is 50% cotton, 50% bamboo. I ordered the colors that they wanted. We have a local shop that carries it, and I was able to buy this color locally, but they had requested some pretty colors too. So my plan is to make them a few more of these using this color, but also there's plenty of leftover. I think I could have made 6 knockers with one ball of this. It really doesn't take much. Earlier this year, I started taking some sewing classes at a local fabric store. And they're not classes in that there's a curriculum and they're teaching everybody the same thing. It's a bring your own project and get help when you need it. Or the teacher comes around and she's kind of observing how you're doing things, and she'll say, oh, you know, there's an easier way of doing that. Or let me show you this. I can ask a question about how do I make sure that I'm staying on the grain line, like what's the trick if I'm not at the fold, and then she'll show me something that seems so obvious, but it wasn't obvious because I didn't think of it. She's just such a handy reference, and she's very good with fitting. So when you're trying to figure out how to fit something, she is able to tell you visually what's going on. So there's several of us who have done mock-ups in different places, and she can give feedback on where the fit issue might be and what you might need to do. It's been a fantastic resource. So in this latest session, which just ended yesterday, I was sewing a sleeveless shirt dress made in linen. Each of my projects, I'm trying to learn several new things, just build up my sort of repertoire and kind of figure out what things I like to sew or what techniques I prefer using. And there's plenty for me to learn. I don't need to do something simple and just repeat that over and over again. The dress that I made is called the Alder Shirtdress. It's from Grainline Studio. So the things that I wanted to learn in this, well, first of all, I wanted a sleeveless linen shirt dress. I live in linen dresses in the summer, and I knew it was something that I wanted. So the things that I was learning was something with a collar and a collar stand. It has buttons all the way down, so using my machine to do the buttonholes and getting them spaced and lined up correctly. There was a yoke in it, so it's a lined yoke. It did not use the burrito method. It was a different method. The next project I work will use the burrito method for the yoke. So I'm conscious of those kinds of things. Bias a tape to finish the armholes. It had a shirt tail. It has a shirt tail hem, which is, so a very narrow hem. There's just a variety of things that I was learning. And she was a fantastic resource for that. So I finished it yesterday. I sewed on the buttons. I was pretty much done with it, maybe even a week ago, and I just needed buttons. It's been really interesting to me to look at how sewing and knitting overlap, like the skills that I have in knitting, like what things that I have practiced in my knitting life I can use in my sewing life. And one of those is sort of button selection. It's always agonizing for me to choose buttons. I always need help. But over the years, I just get a sense of what it is I'm looking for in buttons. And I had an idea with this shirt dress, and it worked out. I was able to get, and I'm really happy with how that worked out. So I've got it on my dress form so that you can see it, and then I can zoom in on it so you can see different elements of it. So this is the shirt dress, and I don't know how I'll zoom in on these a little better, but this has pockets, it has bust darts, it's got the shirt collar, and the button placket. So these are all things that were new to me. So I don't know how well you can see it, but there's little flecks of red in the fabric. And I could not find buttons that were in the blue range that were going to work well with this. So I found some red ones, and I think it looks pretty nice with that. So that's what I chose for buttons. Get my chair out of the way. So I think you can see most of it on me here. So the thing I was most worried about was the fit across here, because my full bust and my high bust are the same measurement. And that's okay in a sweater. But in a sewing pattern, they assume that your high bust is 2 inches smaller than your full bust. And if there is less difference, they assume that you are kind of small busted, and you might need to do a small bust adjustment, where if the difference is larger, you might need to do a full bust adjustment. And my issue is not that I'm small busted, it's that my back kind of goes up in a V. And so my torso just keeps getting wider as it comes up. So I was worried about that, but I did do a mock-up of just, a bare mock-up of the front, the two fronts, and a layer of the yoke to see how the armholes fit. And at first they were too tight. But she's like, okay, but there's going to be seam allowance because the edges of the sleeve are going to be turning in. So she snipped it around, and we could tell that, oh yeah, it was going to fit. So it's a pretty close fit though. I do have room, but it is kind of a close fit. It ends just above my knees. I can't show you high enough. That there's like a shirt tail hem to it. But I think I really like it. It turned out, I was, assuming that it was not going to fit me right. I was afraid before I put the buttons on that it was going to be too tight. And then once I got them on, I'm like, nope, I can move or I can stretch a little bit and it's okay. So I'm really happy, and you will probably see me in videos this summer wearing this when it actually warms up. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.